mecanismo de solução de controvérsias. No fundo, enquanto não houver um outro sistema de solução de controvérsias, tudo vai acabar no OMC. Não é? Voltando à questão da ISO, na medida em que os standards acordados na ISO são standards governamentais, eles estarão, digamos, estarão submetidos às regras do OMC. E uma vez mais, o standard não é porque o standard foi imposto na ISO que ele é automaticamente compatível com o OMC. O que é preciso atentar é que ele seja aplicado de maneira não discriminatória, quer dizer, você não pode botar um standard ISO para o produto importado e não o mesmo standard para o produto fabricado internamente. E que ele não seja um obstáculo desnecessário ao comércio.
Well, thank you very much for this interesting clarification and for your honest answer as well. Because we're still in terms of certification schemes and compliance, I have a question, a follow-up question to you, Jane, from Rodrigo Lima from Econe, who sees that some sustainability standards seems to force hard time in order to be WTO compliant. How would you see, well, the issue of indirect land use change was already touched upon, but how would you see ILUC or the concept of high value, high conservation value land within voluntary certification schemes and trade rules? It's a tough one.
That's another easy question. I think that high conservation value land, there are some international standards that pertain to it, but I think in the last analysis, it's the responsibility of the country to define the best use of the land. And that's why I think that even though there are lots of problems with sustainability standards and their interpretation and probably their WTO consistency, they're most likely going to be a fact of life in the next few years, and it's really important for Brazil to be the maker of these standards as well as the recipient of them. And that's why I encourage you all to be actively involved in them. There are lots of problems with them. I understand those, but I think defining high conservation value land, defining the best use of land in Brazil is really important. The climate change agreement is going to do to many countries in the context of land use what the WTO agreement did to many countries in the context of domestic regulation. It's going to put a gloss on all of it. So it's important for countries to determine their own fate as much as possible in that context. So.
Thank you. I would like to turn to Per. You've been a pioneer in sustainability-related issues by launching the Sustainable Ethanol Initiatives. This was designed at a time where consumers in Sweden were asking for it, I believe, that responded to a need in Sweden. And I believe this has been quite a successful initiative. However, we've seen with the decrease in oil prices that the demand in Sweden for E85 has fallen as well, which leads to my question, which would be about the priority for consumers. Although the ethanol in Sweden is certified as being sustainable, there's less interest given the prices. So what would you see as a future for this scheme if we persist with lower oil prices? And secondary to that question is, how would that scheme fit into the recently approved directive for renewable energy sources in the EU? Would you intend to terminate that scheme once new schemes take over and comply with the directive, or would you like to keep on having this private initiative?
There were a lot of questions in one question.
Yes.
But first of all, we just felt it was absolutely necessary, given the debate that we had in 2006 and really 2007, on sustainability issues, and where, I mean, ethanol was responsible for all the bad things in the world. And we have a market that is really developing fast. So we really picked out what are the big issues, what are the issues that is in the debate. What is the CO2 reduction in reality? What can we actually verify? What are the legal conditions for the workers? Are there actually rainforests being cut or not? Are the child workers or not? So we actually picked out those 6, 7 important issues, and actually worked then with a number of I would say, interested partners in Brazil that were willing to join this. And we know that most of them here in Central Sul are already meeting these requirements. But here we can do it in a way where we actually can verify it. That was the thing. And that was because there is a lot of talk about these things, but really there are no methodologies in place. There are no systems in place. And that brings us back to my point that as long as we have this tension in trade, there are a lot of players that don't want to have sustainable biofuels on the market because that's the best argument for a non-tariff barrier. So that's a hidden agenda that a lot of players are having, and they threw that sand into the machinery because that's a very effective non-tariff barrier. So we were developing these issues in order to develop trade, not to restrict the trade, because it's a necessary, it's a mandatory that you can provide the consumers with that kind of good conscience that you are doing something good, not something wrong. So that's the first thing why we did it. Secondly, when you had this collapse in the oil market last year in October, November, at one hand you can say, yes, the market dropped 60% in 1 month. On the other hand, you can say 40% of the consumers continued to buy ethanol even though it was 20% more expensive per kilometer. But the 60% showed that when it became obviously much more expensive, they chose to go for gasoline instead of ethanol. So, you know, if the glass half full or half empty, that's a question. Now, with the oil price coming back to $67, the market starts to pick up again, and they can go very quickly. And what's your third question?
Well, it was about the future of the sustainable ethanol initiatives.
You have to have, you know, criteria for sustainability. I mean, that's the reality. You may ask the question, of course, why don't we have these criteria for when we buy sugar, and it's produced exactly in the same way as it produced ethanol? But that's reality. That's how things are. And let's do it the other way around now. Biofuels can serve as that instrument to also improve the requirements for sustainable agriculture. So that's not an argument why we should not do it, but you know there are a lot of hidden agendas behind this. We are importing much more soya to feed our pigs and other, you know, cattle, and there is no question about the soya really, you know, hurting the rainforest and so on. But the ethanol and the sugarcane, maybe indirectly, but certainly not directly, is being accused for threatening the rainforest. Because again, we haven't sorted out the trade issues. There are so many hidden agendas. There are so many vested interests that are trying to throw dirt on the ethanol until we have sorted out these trade issues. So if we sort out the trade issues, we can much more constructively work with the sustainability issues, more from a scientific and a constructive way. And if we don't do that, we will continue to be stuck in this gridlock of unconstructive or destructive way of talking about sustainability.
Okay. Well, thank you for this extremely complete answer. I'm turning now to Mr. Saito. I have a few questions for you. We understand that land availability in Japan may be restricted. Would the Japanese government consider a more proactive policy to promote biofuels? Because currently it's a limit which is put on the ethanol content in gasoline. It's not a mandatory blend. Would you consider a more proactive policy, but also the corresponding reduction in tariff duties for imports?
Okay. So the important point is still in Japan, the system is under construction. As I mentioned, we mix ethanol, but oil companies want to use it as a ETBE. So still there are no one standard. Still many companies try to do their own way. So the most important point is to establish the system of Japan. And for that, there are many problems, and we have to negotiate with oil companies in Japan, motorcycle companies in Japan, distributors. There are many stakeholders to work with to build up the system. And if we want to build up the system, of course the 3% up level is maybe not enough. And just, of course, now there are so many regulations, and we have to consider how to utilize the ethanol, how to import Brazil or other countries the ethanol to utilize in Japanese system. And on the other hand, we are trying to produce local biomass energy. So that is the point of local economy. So local production and local consumption is still important issue in Japan, because in Japan there's so many small islands, isolated area. So some area, if we waste biomass, it's just waste. But if we produce some energy from the wasted biomass, it's very useful for local areas, especially isolated areas such as small island, far from the main island in Japan. So as I mentioned, 2 points. One is we have to build up our system, and second, still we need a system for local, considering the local economy. Okay. Thank you.
Still on Japan, I have an interesting, be frank with me if you are not in a position to talk about this one, but I have a question regarding the car industry in Japan, which we know is important. I have a comment from Sergio Trinidad here saying that Toyota would not sell cars in Brazil if they would not offer warranty on the vehicle. Could you let us know about the plans for the Japanese car manufacturer to move into renewable fuel sources? In Europe, for instance, Toyota is very much promoting the hybrid system, whereas here they've finally had to enter the market to do flex fuel. Could you eventually let us know if you are in a position?
So actually, I'm not in the right person to talk about industries, because I'm from the Ministry of Agriculture. We are working for the materials, not the machine or ethanol itself. But still, Japanese companies, Japanese industries, very considering the environmental free or utilization of biomass. So now, again, it is difficult for some companies, because in Japan, still we are negotiating with energy companies, government, and manufacturers. So I believe once we build up the system, of course, the technologies of Japanese companies is very high. So I believe with company going forward together